Welcome to the army part of the Vampire Counts series, where we'll be taking a look at their heroes and their army, and how they might work in Total War Warhammer. I have annotations in the video here, so you can click to skip to heroes or army, if you so desire. First up, we'll start with the big bad himself, Vlad von Carsten, the progenitor of the von Carsten bloodline. The vampire who more or less founded the Vampire Counts as pertains to the Empire. Now, this is one of those characters I do not think it is even possible to do in a Total War game because he is so ridiculously powerful. He is stronger than an ogre, faster, and more deadly than one to be sure, and is essentially a bit of a one-man army. Some of his special rules, for example, give him a 4+ ward save. Now, what that means is that if he gets hit by something that would normally just kill him, like a cannonball to the face, for example, on a roll of 4+, on a d6, he completely ignores it. It just bounces off him. Additionally, he has a 4+ chance, so a 50-50 chance to regenerate instantly any wound he takes. So, already he's nigh on unkillable, but just to make sure you don't get any funky ideas about actually murdering the guy, if you do manage to kill him, on a roll of 2+ on a d6, he gets right back up again. So he is an immortal beastie capable of taking on entire units and just butchering most monsters. It's almost impossible to implement something like this in a Total War game unless you have him absolutely wreck your economy. Like if he has an absolutely insane upkeep, and even then, it's hard to really find a way where he would ever be balanced. Maybe you could summon him in a single battle, for example, or maybe he could hang around in the Vampire Count capital, a bit of a boss fight, so to say. You could kill him, but you're going to need overwhelming forces to do so, so it could be interesting to have him as the big bad boss fight for the Vampire Counts faction. But in a purely recruitable field army sense, I think this guy's pretty much impossible. Which is too bad, because he is an awesome little character, and he has one of the most kick-ass models in Warhammer Fantasy. Next up is his de facto successor, Manfred von Carsten. Now this guy is nowhere near as much of a sheer monster as his big daddy, and can be killed, which in and of itself is a step down. He's not a particularly good fighter, and he's not a particularly good sorcerer, but he's above average in both. The real benefit to having this guy is that he would have access to tons of special units, because he employs undead from pretty much the entire world. You'll have orc skeletons fighting next to beastmen skeletons, fighting next to Tomb King skeletons, fighting next to decaying knights of Bretonnia, etc. The way they could do this is give him and him alone access to a bunch of cool, unique mercenaries, essentially, that you could buy, or, well, preferably you'd spend some kind of magical resource to do it, but you get my drift. He can acquire these mercenaries, which would have slightly different stat lines, and mostly just be a cool fluff thing, but he's eminently more balanceable than his big daddy, so we might see this guy pop up. Last of the big three vampires is Konrad von Carsten. I'm thinking you might be able to see a theme here with the Vampire Count heroes. Anyways, Konrad von Carsten is a vampire who is absolutely, thoroughly, through and through, batshit, no pun intended, insane. He has a special rule that is literally named one bat short of a belfry. The way this affects him in tabletop is that every turn you roll a dice. Depending on the result of that dice, Konrad might be an obedient little boy and go do what you told him to. He might decide that he likes it right where he is and won't move, or he might decide to start killing things around him, usually friendlies, or, best of all, he might just go berserk and charge headlong against whatever's closest to it, which is usually a good idea because Konrad is a bit of a combat monster that actually gets a bonus damage for fighting bigger enemies. He could be a really cool option in Total War Warhammer by, for example, having the ability to upgrade, should I say, a unit of Blood Dragons, for example. To be led by Conrad von Carsten, it would make them extremely unreliable. They might just sit there, not do anything, they might charge off without any instructions. You have no idea what these bastards will do, but they are the perfect anti-big guy unit. And the Vampire Counts do not have that many units capable of really dealing properly and brutally one-sidedly with big, nasty bastards. Additionally, of course, he just looks kick-ass. He has a beautiful little model, and if this guy can be modeled properly in Total War Warhammer without it breaking the game and lagging to all hell, or, you know, his textures disappearing or something, he could be a real cool centerpiece general for your army. And unlike the traditional Total War general, this guy would most definitively not be sitting in the back ranks as a glorified standard. There are other minor heroes in the Vampire Count's army list, like Henrik Kemmler, who is essentially just a bigger bad necromancer. I'd much rather have you be able to build your own heroes rather than having him, seeing as he's essentially just a necromancer. He's nothing particularly special. The same goes for his permanent companion, Krell, Lord of Undeath. He's essentially just a wight. He's reasonably good in combat, and he gets the heroic killing blow rule, which means that on a dice roll he has the ability to instantaneously kill things with multiple hit points, or wounds as it's named in the Warhammer Fantasy Battle. But again, I'd rather you just be able to do that with one of your guys, because they are relatively minor heroes, and it'd be really cool to add your own big baddies to the universe with the option of putting in some of the proper big cannons of the faction for flavor, effect, and just a little touch of that Warhammer feel, making it a Warhammer Total War game instead of just a Total War game set in the Warhammer universe. So, moving on, I'll take a look at the possibilities of generals. In this case, I'm thinking these would be essentially family members. These would be your generals, and you could specialize them to be whatever you would want them to be. You can make a hardcore combat dude, you can make a hardcore mage, you could even perhaps make a dude that's just hardcore supporting with lots of buffs and stuff. So, the classes that the Vampire Count list have that could be used in this role in Total War Warhammer is the Vampire Lord, and he's exactly what it says on the tin. He's a big bad vampire, reasonably good at magic, reasonably good at combat. He's not particularly bad at anything, but he is a little bit squishy, and if he dies, your undead army, who relies upon him to keep them animated, starts crumbling, which is a feature I would love for them to add into a Total War game, simply because it gives a little bit of an element of fragility to the undead army, which is very much so there in the Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Now, it would make it a little bit too easy to perhaps just target him down with artillery and thereby win a very easy battle, but you could get around that by ways and means. Like, most of these vampires have the ability to turn into bats, for example. Some of them don't even give a shit if they get hit with the cannonball, so you could work around it. Furthermore, we have the Master Necromancer. Again, exactly what it says on the tin. He's a really, really, really good Necromancer. Now, why you would ever have a human Necromancer lead your Vampire Count's army when you have access to bloody vampires is beyond me, but hey, personal taste and all of that wonderfulness. Alternatively, I would prefer it if you just have access to vampires. They are your family members, and you have necromancers serving them, which is essentially what happens in the Warhammer Fantasy Battles. The necromancers are very much so subordinate to the vampires. I would love a progression system where, for example, you get a randomly generated dude, and you can give him a name, and you can specialize him as he levels up, and when he reaches a certain level, you can choose to turn him into a vampire, giving him an all-around stat boost, and giving you a bit of sense of progression. Might be some high hopes there. I am by no means sure they will even be able to do that, or even if it is possible within the current Warscape engine, assuming they're going to keep it, which I really hope they don't. It's getting old now. But moving on to the last one is the Strigoi Ghoul King. Now, if you watch my lore video, you'll know that the Strigoi are different from the other vampires, seeing as they are basically just giant, hulking, mutated beasties with very little actual intelligence, closer to animals than they are the sophisticated lords of the night that the other vampire lords very much so represent. However, that doesn't mean he can't lead an army. He just leads an army in a slightly different way. Rather than the more traditional army of undead, he leads hordes of ghouls and other monstrous creatures, of which there are plenty in the Vampire Count's army list. Now, he probably shouldn't be able to lead a traditional Vampire Count army simply because he's not very good at it. He's not much of a wizard. He can reanimate corpses into undead soldiers, but it's more an instinct thing than a real skill, so it'd be very hard for a Strigoi to animate a proper undead army. However, you could sacrifice the variety of units, so to say, to have a very flavorful horde of ghouls and monsters led by a very powerful character, capable of serving as essentially a big guy monster, adding a bit of punch to your fairly quick and fairly powerful in melee army, but you would be sacrificing pretty much all magical support and all ranged support. Could be interesting, but probably a nightmare to balance. So, again, I'd love for them to put all of this stuff in, but for the sake of balance, I'm probably thinking they're going to be sticking to just the Funkasten vampires, for example, instead of adding in the Strigoi or the Necrocs or the Blood Dragons, simply because it would mean you'd have to make more skill trees, more armies, more stuff, more balancing things. It could be added as DLC though, which I wouldn't really mind. Like, you give us a full character development tree with its own unique units, a la the Strigoi and their ghouls. I'd be fine with that, as long as you charged us a reasonable price. That'd be pretty cool DLC, and a good way to expand upon an already existing race, rather than just giving them an arbitrary unit pack, say. Now, onto the units themselves. First of all, the lowly zombies. What would a Vampire Count army be without zombies? They're terrible at fighting, they can't move with shit, and they're essentially useless for anything except eating as many enemy missiles as humanly possible, or, well, as zombily possible. Which is a fair deal. Zombies are, well, not particularly durable, being undead and stuff. They only have one wound. However, they're cheap as all hell. In tabletop, I believe they are 3 points a pop, so 3 points per zombie, which makes them the second cheapest unit in Warhammer Fantasy Battles. The only one that cheapers is Skaven Slaves, and while Skaven Slaves do have a slightly more impressive stat line than your average zombies, Skaven Slaves cannot be replenished on the go. Zombies can. If you have a skilled necromancer in army, you can raise several zombies and add them to an already existing unit, giving you a fairly stable and solid unit that will be able to soak up a lot more firepower than your opponent might be comfortable with. Additionally, being undead, they're not particularly easily frightened. In fact, they will never run away. So they would be an excellent blocking unit, capable of eating a cavalry charge, for example, protecting your more important unit, or just simply eating enemy missile fire. It would be a pretty damn easy unit to implement. The whole replenishing on the fly thing is going to be a bit of a challenge, but not like it's that problematic. You could essentially just have the zombies spawn out of the ground, clawing their way up and all of that goodness, via the magical aid of the necromancers or even the vampire lord. And if they are doing vampire counts, they have to have the zombies. They're just a key part of the vampire count army, really. A step up from the zombies, though, we have the skeleton warriors. The zombies do not possess any recollection of their previous lives. They are essentially just meat puppets, animated by the will of the necromancer or the vampire. They're shit at fighting because they can't really fight. They don't know how to fight, they don't know why they fight, and they're not particularly quick either. Skeleton warriors, however, are reanimated soldiers, and they retain just enough knowledge of their previous profession to make them, if not exceptional, then at the very least reasonably competent frontline fighters. And again, they can be reinforced via magic on the battlefield, and being undead, they're never going to be running away. They are a fair bit more expensive than zombies, so using them as a missile shield is not really ideal, but using them as your primary holding force while the big baddies get around on the flanks and rear is a perfectly adequate tactic. And again, they're very easy to implement. They're essentially just infantry, except they don't have a leadership value. Onto something in the Vampire Count army that is actually alive, Crypt Ghouls. They're fairly expensive for a Vampire Count unit, but they're not terrible fighters. In particular, they're quite tough and absolutely ferocious in melee. They attack twice in the Warhammer Fantasy Battle setting, and units that attack twice are quite rare. Most units, the vast majority of them, only have one. In Total War, this should probably be represented simply by the fact that they attack really, really fast, or give them simply an increased attack. Adding to this fact is the fact that they also are not very clean creatures. They like digging through crypts and eating corpses and all kinds of horribleness, meaning that they are extremely filthy, which is why their attacks are also poisonous. Now, modeling poison in Total War could be a little problematic, but I would probably say that it should work more or less like a debuff. If a unit gets hit by a Crypt Ghoul, he is debuffed, and this is an individual models instead of the entire unit, because that'd be a bit silly. Reducing his attack and defense skill, for example. This should probably just be in that battle, as modeling the effects of long-term poisoning and disease on the campaign map might be a little overboard, especially for single miniatures. But other than that, it's a reasonably simple unit to implement and would give the Vampire Count a reasonably fast, fairly aggressive, and very ferocious melee unit to use as a bit of a mid-tier hammer to the Skeleton's anvil. But that's not the only things in the Vampire Count armies that are actually alive. Vampire Count armies employ dire wolves, big-ass, furry little beasties that are probably one of the fastest unit in the Vampire Count armies, making them essentially light cavalry, excellent for hunting down enemy light cavalry, archers, war machines, and anything else they can get within nibbling range of. They are by no means bad fighters. Well, fighters. They're giant wolves, you know? They're pretty dangerous, and you can have a fair few of them. And as a light cavalry unit, they would probably be implemented more or less like a light cavalry unit. You have 60 dire wolves, and they'd probably beat an equivalent unit of 60 light cavalry if they could catch them. Now, a wolf is not as fast as a horse when you're running long distances. However, in Fantasy Battle, the dire wolves have a special ability named Swift Stride, which allows you to roll 3d6s and discard the lowest number and add the 2 remaining to their charge distance, so they could have a bonus to charge speed, allowing them to actually catch up with the things they're supposed to be nobbing. And since the Vampire Counts don't have that much light cavalry, they could be a really cool flavor unit for them. Back onto the undead though, we'll touch upon the other proper cavalry unit in the undead army, the Black Knights. Black Knights are reasonably heavy cavalry by Warhammer standards, and very fast heavy cavalry by Warhammer standards because of their special ability Spectral Steeds. They are riding essentially undead horses. This means that there's not a lot of flesh and stuff that can get caught on things, which means that they can ignore terrain penalties. Essentially, while a normal cavalry unit might be slowed by woods or rivers or rocky ground, these guys will just ride straight on through without being hindered. Additionally, to make use of their excellent mobility, they are by no means bad in a fight. They are heavy cavalry, they are wearing heavy armor, they can be equipped with lances, and they're pretty damn good in just flat up melee combat. Additionally, they have the Killing Blows special rule, which means that they have the ability to completely ignore a target's toughness and armor on a dice roll of 6, I believe, on a d6, which basically gives them a 1 in 6 chance to instantaneously kill an enemy. Now, a 1 in 6 chance to instantaneously kill an enemy in Total War game would be absurdly bullshit and would basically make them nigh on invincible, but you could give them this against big monsters, give them a special ability like they have increased attack against things that are bigger than them, like ogres, etc. Making them one of the few proper answers that the Vampire Count army has to big guys. Additionally, they're again pretty damn easy to model in-game, as they are essentially just heavy cavalry that would have some buffs to their movement speed. They'd be pretty damn fast, and while normal cavalry could be slowed down by, like I said, woods or the terrain, these guys could just ride on through it at their max speed. The other anti-big guy unit that comes in on foot is the lesser cousin of the Black Knight, the Grave Guard. These guys are essentially beefed up skeleton warriors in heavy armor, big shields with the Killing Blow special rules, and an increased stat line. They're heavy infantry, and they're pretty damn good heavy infantry. And they can also be replenished via magical means, giving you a very, very solid anvil upon which to smite the enemy with your hammer. They can also make an extremely potent bodyguard for your Vampire Lord, and should really present no problem as for their implementation in a Total War game. The final elite unit, so to say, of the Vampire Count's army is the infamous Blood Knight. Now, if you watch my lore video, you'll know exactly what a Blood Knight is. These guys are ridiculously expensive. They're 50 points per man, which makes them about the equal of most hero-level characters or captains. They are essentially an entire cavalry unit of Blood Dragon vampires. They are one of the heaviest heavy cavalry units in Warhammer Fantasy, and this is a universe in which they are competing with ogres riding giant rhinoceroses, so yeah, they're pretty damn insane heavy. On top of all that, they have a +4 ward save against ranged attacks, so again, cannonballs don't really bother them that much. They have an incredible stat line, they will beat the absolute living snot out of most other units, and could be an absolutely fantastic delivery system for your kitted up close combat monster of a Vampire Lord, creating an absolute sledgehammer of a unit. Speaking of sledgehammers, I did mention that the Vampire Counts have access to some fairly uncomfortably large monsters. So, starting out with the biggest and the baddest, the Terrorgeist. Now, in this case, appearances are deceiving. This is not actually a dragon, though it certainly looks like it. The Vampire Count does have access to a dragon, which I will touch upon later, but this is not it. This is essentially a pile of various bones and other materials reanimated into unholy life by a particularly powerful necromancer. The Terrorgeist is a considerably powerful unit with the ability to fly, and as such is extremely maneuverable. It's also reasonably tough with a fairly impressive stat line, perfect for dealing with enemy elite units like heavy cavalry, for example, units that don't have that many attacks back, because the Terrorgeist is not all of that tough. It does have regeneration, although it is only a 6+, so it's not going to be regenning all that much, and it doesn't have that many wounds, so it's not a particularly beefy creature. It's going to struggle against fully ranked up enemy units of infantry, and it's also one of the bigger magnets for cannonballs and other nasty things in the Vampire Count army. It can be taken as a mount for a Strigoi Ghoul King, however, doing so, you just put an absolute massive amount of resources into one unit, and it's now also your Vampire Count General, so it's going to be attracting a metric ton of incoming firepower. By itself, though, the Terrorgeist is an excellent elite killer, like I mentioned, and it also has a special ability. While most dragons have some kind of breath weapon, this, not being a dragon, still has something akin to this. This power is named Death Shriek. It is essentially a beefed up version of the Banshee's Shriek ability. It causes wounds directly to the model, ignoring armor. Which is exactly why it's so good at killing elite units, because most of the time, elite units aren't particularly tough, as in having lots of wounds, but they are usually ridiculously heavily armored to the point where a normal soldier with a spear or sword are going to be struggling to even wound them in the first place. Being undead, it can be healed by magic, so you could keep this thing going for quite a while. In Warhammer Tabletop, it would probably be the weakest of the super big guy dragon-sized thingies, since this should probably come in one-man units, so to say, the Terrorgeist alone. You should probably be able to pick it as a mount as well, and it would work much the same way, I would think, struggling against large units of infantry, simply because it doesn't have that many hit points, and is not armored in any real sense. However, it would be able to absolutely munch on enemy cavalry, simply because while it hits really hard, it also has the Death Shriek, and it won't be receiving quite as much shit in return. Being a flyer, it is of course also extremely fast, and therefore one of the perfect units for dealing with units of light cavalry, as lightly armored horsemen probably won't be able to do much damage to it, and it will be able to munch on them in peace and quiet. Next, something slightly smaller, the Vargheist. This thing is about as fast as the Terrorgeist, but it's not quite as flimsy. It doesn't have quite as an impressive a stat line, but it is a vampire, so it's going to be having regeneration. Though again, they're not that tough. They're essentially glass cannons. They want to be smashing through the front lines and then getting the hell back out again. And they would be excellent to counter war machines and archers, light cavalry, that kind of stuff, because it will absolutely nom-nom all of them, and it has the speed to catch them. And any unit that's going to want to, inflict harm upon the Vargheist is also going to have to catch it. Easier said than done. But if that's too small for you, you've always got the Vargolf, the Vargeist's meth-addicted big brother, and probably the biggest sledgehammer in the Vampire Count army, well, aside from the Blood Dragons, of course. This thing can't fly, so it's not nearly as fast as its competitors, but it has a bit better of a stat line, it's a fair bit tougher, and again, Terror, Frenzy, and regeneration. Now, speaking of Terror, Terror is a special rule in Warhammer Tabletop. Essentially, it is given to units that are big and scary that would inflict, well, terror upon their enemies, and what it essentially does, it gives them a rather large leadership penalty, so leadership is their morale, so to say, which makes it more likely for them to fail a morale test and then run away. Additionally, it also forces the unit to take a morale test right then and there with the negative modifier. Now, there is a lot of undead units that have the Terror special ability. Some of them have a weaker version, which is just Fear. It is the same as Terror in that it inflicts a morale penalty and forces a leadership test to see if the unit runs away, but it's not as powerful. Now, the way this should probably be modeled in Total War is simply as a rather large morale penalty, rather than an outright leadership test to see if they run away, because if you do that, you're either going to have to make the test so easy to pass that it doesn't really have the impact it's supposed to, or you make it too hard to pass, which means that you essentially now have a unit that can instantaneously rout enemy units, which would be pretty damn ridiculous. But if it is a rather considerable morale penalty, it would make creatures like this exceptionally good flankers and rear attackers, which is exactly what they're supposed to be. Fighting an undead army isn't so much about killing the undead in front of you. Like, you will eventually wear down the meat shield of skeletons and zombies. The question is whether or not you can do that before your guys shit their pants and run screaming over the hills. So, having fear and terror simply be a morale penalty seems like a reasonably good choice. It'll also make your general a lot more important while fighting these undead armies, as he needs to be racing up and down your lines, reassuring your men, so that at some point you might actually want to use your rally ability, to keep their morale up, keep their spirit up. And it would make playing Vampire Count feel a little bit more like it's actually supposed to feel. You're fighting with inferior units, yes, but you're fighting with scary inferior units. You are not so much trying to kill your enemy army as you're trying to make it run. Now, after that little tangent, back to the unit in question. And this is one of those units where you don't necessarily need to be getting around the flanks. It'll greatly benefit if you put the care in to have it actually get around the enemy, but this thing could definitively punch through a relatively solid front line, and probably even live to tell the tale. Sticking to the bestial theme, we'll go onwards to the Bat Swarm. Now, Bat Swarm is exactly what it says on the tin. Again, it's a swarm of bats. Excellent for annoying skirmishers and taking out war machine crews. They probably can't kill them, because after all they are just bats, but they will keep them far too busy to be shooting up the rest of your army, and being small, fast flyers, they're pretty damn hard to kill off before they actually get into annoying range. They're not much for fighting, as I said, but they can certainly keep a unit occupied for quite a while. Have this unit be 160 strong, for example, in which each one of those models is a small swarm of bats, and they could tie down bigger, nastier units for quite a while, although they wouldn't last long against proper infantry. Monsters or anything with an AoE attack would absolutely destroy them in seconds, because they're just bats, not particularly tough. Something that is pretty damn tough though, the Cairn Wraiths. These ghostly monstrosities are pretty damn competent fighters with the terror ability, of course, because ghosts. Reasonably tough because of their ethereal special ability, which in Total War I would probably just assume would work as a percentage chance that when you attack them with normal weapons, you have, for example, a fairly high chance, 75% chance, for example, of just simply not doing any damage as your sword passes through them harmlessly. If you're attacking them with magical weapons, however, you're going to be hitting all the time, and they're going to be melting damn fast. Their main advantage is the simple fact that they are ethereals. They could tie up very large units of infantry for a very long time, and do considerable damage while doing so, if you can rely on the ethereal ability. Now, if they didn't have ethereal, this should be a fairly large unit, since they're not that good as fighters, but they do inspire terror, and they're certainly better than your average footman. But since they are ethereal, this should be a fairly small unit. Maybe 5 to 10 maximum, which means that a ranked unit of infantry is still going to just simply outgrind them, but they could hold them up for a reasonable amount of time, and they would be excellent countermeasures to skirmishers, for example, as a fair amount of their ammunition is simply going to pass harmlessly through them. Additionally, being ethereal, they of course just ignore cover and terrain, so these guys would be able to move through forests and other impediments at full speed. There are also some lesser versions of these named Spirit Hosts, which works kind of like the Bat Swarm in that it's not a single entity, it is a swarm of ghosts, essentially. Again, they would be ethereal, with a reasonably bad stat line, and this could be a relatively large unit, maybe 100 models if we're thinking the average unit is about 160. They would melt incredibly quickly to anything with magical weapons or some kind of magical attack, but they could tie up large units for a very long time, and they could do it safer than the Cairn Wraiths, because the Cairn Wraiths have lower numbers but do more damage. They're more of a glass cannon, whereas the Spirit Hosts would be a net, almost, to slow down enemy units. Last up for the Wraiths, we have the Hex Wraiths. These are essentially Black Knights on foot, except for one little difference. They come with great weapons, two-handed weapons, which makes them dangerous enough if it weren't also for the fact that they are ethereal, which makes them a real pain in someone's ass. Not only are they going to be hitting you like absolute trucks, they're going to be ignoring quite a lot of the stuff that's incoming in return. And being mounted, they're pretty damn mobile. They would be excellent for killing skirmishing cavalry if they could catch them, granted, which, being ethereal and being able to ignore terrain, they probably should be able to, and they would absolutely chew apart any unit of light cavalry. But again, being relatively expensive, being relatively unstable, e.g. magical weapons would absolutely just annihilate them, they're a bit of a glass cannon unit. But the same can be said for many vampire counter units, so if you do like glass cannons, this army is certainly for you. Now we've done most of the normal units, so to say, so let's touch upon some of the more unique things, like the Corpse Cart. The Corpse Cart is a chariot in its rule stead, but it's not actually used as a chariot, it's used essentially as a mount, almost, for a necromancer, giving him various bonuses to his ability to resurrect skeletons and zombies. I would prefer to see this thing and its bigger cousin, which I'll discuss shortly, as a mount rather than as an actual unit. Pop your favorite necromancer on a corpse cart, and he gains, for example, a level of magic. He just gets more effective overall, but in return, he loses the ability to join a unit, which means that he's not as well protected as he could be, and he's now riding a giant-ass cart in the middle of a battlefield and is probably going to be the primary target of every single artillery piece on your opponent's side of the board. Whether or not the trade-off for the extra magic is worth it could be a really interesting dynamic of the Vampire Count's army. You'd be trading out the protection of a unit, but you'd be gaining magical power and the ability to regenerate your army faster. Then you've got the Mortis engine, which is essentially the same thing, but it's bigger, nastier, and would give better benefits to whoever is riding it. It is also not quite just a cart, so to say. It is essentially alive, so it has the ability to regenerate. Don't ask me how, it does. And it gives even greater benefits to the necromancer or even the vampire who's riding it. That being said, though, being even larger than the corpse cart and giving even bigger benefits, it's going to be attracting every single cannonball, bolt thrower, mage, or anything else on your opponent's team that has any chance at all of hurting it. So this is probably the granddaddy of all the glass cannons. Incredible benefits if you can actually keep the bastard alive, but actually making it stick is going to be quite difficult. Though, with some combined arms, you could, for example, just surround it with zombies. The zombies would eat up most of the incoming light weapons, although they still couldn't do much against a cannonball, but meat shielding this thing could be a viable tactic. Lastly, I'll touch upon some of the mounts available to the vampire counts, and in this respect I'm basically thinking things you can mount your characters on. Now, I've already touched upon the corpse cart and the Mortis engine, so these are just more combat-y mounts, giving your characters more mobility and in some cases more of a punch in close combat. First up, we have the very basic skeletal steed. It's an undead horse, it has the ethereal ability, it can move through terrain. Lots of additional mobility, not a whole lot of additional protection, but it would be a prerequisite to put your hero inside a mounted unit. Then there's the slightly upgraded Barded Nightmare, which is a bigger, badder undead horse, which could give you some additional protection as it is indeed barded, and would mean that your character would not be too out of place in a unit of Blood Dragon vampires, for example, or in the Black Knights, making him just that little bit tougher while still keeping his mobility and making him into a reasonably valuable frontline commander. If you're going to go the full distance, you've got the Hell Steed, which is a flying barded nightmare. It's, well, essentially just a better horse. Now, seeing as it's flying, you probably can't put him in most units as vampires, Blood Dragon vampires, Black Knight, etc. They don't fly. I guess you could kind of put him in a unit of Vagasts, for example, but that'd be odd. I'd more like to just see this as an extremely high mobility mount, allowing the hero to quickly move from one side of the battlefield to the other. And lastly, we have the big baddie himself, the mount that no true vampire count would ever be without, the zombie dragon. Ah, what a beauty. Nigh on unkillable, heavily armored, strong as all hell, and an absolute monster in close combat, it is also undead, because, zombie dragon, so it can be healed with vampire count magic. Additionally, of course, it just looks fucking awesome, and would really add that last little bit of oomph to your close combat vampire lord, should you choose to make him into a bit of a sledgehammer himself. Lastly, I'll briefly touch upon the subject of magic and the vampire counts. Most of vampire counts magic is not offensive, it is supportive. It reinforces units and it gives them buffs, which are capable of turning even lowly zombies into reasonable combat troops, and capable of turning skeletons into a reasonably fearsome opponent. This would require a fairly special magical system, though, based more upon a series of buffs, abilities, and regenerations rather than the artillery approach where they're simply just throwing magical fireballs. Which is why I think the Vampire Count is probably one of the least likely factions to be included in TWW, simply because they are going to have a fairly complicated magical system built around them, which is going to take quite a lot of time, quite a lot of balance, and Creative Assembly is not exactly known for neither of these things. However, they would make a really kick-ass faction that is very different and very enjoyable to play, or at least that is my opinion. I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.